Cheerilee made her way through the backstage area, albeit a good distance away from the whole snails thing, and headed for the dressing room. After seeing that scene with Sweetie Belle, 2 soliloquy scenes followed with Reginald, and then another with the king. Since she took her sweet time, the first one had almost certainly ended already. But as the mare passed a few corridors leading up to the stage itself, she thought she could hear Apple Bloom's voice on stage. As she hurried, she might still be able to assist Snips in finding his costume for the last scene, if he was indeed as dumb as he looked, and hadn't been able to find it on his own yet. As she rounded a corner, something crashed into her at a high speed, causing her to stumble back a few steps as the air got slammed out of her lungs. She looked down when she got her bearings, and saw Snips sitting there on his plot, shaking his head to dispel the dizziness that was set on to him due to the crash. "Snips! What are you doing here? You're not even in costume! You need to get ready for the last scene," she said, by way of reprimand. The Cyan colt, with the oxure mane, looked hugely relieved to see his teacher, and he immediately scrambled to his feet, tears in the corner of his eyes. "Oh, Miss Cheerilee, it's terrible!" he yelled out. "I was looking for my costume, and I couldn't find it, so I went to look for you, and I couldn't find you. But, I found snails, and... He took a huge breath at this point, obviously struggling to get the words out. "And he's dead." Cheerilee's world grinded to a halt with those words, cold sweat breaking out across her forehead as she felt the slightest hint of panic raise up from her stomach like bile. She strayed from her schedule, and she had just found out why that would cost her. Her mind worked frantically to figure out a way to minimize the damage caused, to somehow soothe the colt enough so that her plans could go through. But no easy solution presented itself. Snips, on the other hand, seemed to pull himself together, turning around and taking a few steps. "Come on!" he called back to her. "We can't continue the play now. We've got to tell all the others." Cheerilee felt a block of ice drop into her stomach as the Cyan colt galloped off. No, if he reached any pony else, he would... With a sudden burst of speed that would have dazzled even Rainbow Dash, she rushed forward, catching up to the younger pony in mere seconds. In one fluid movement, she slipped into a full gallop, into a full-blown karate kick, focusing all of her kinetic energy in a single hoof. Snips got hit good in the side, so good in fact that the kick sent him crashing into a nearby wall, at the bottom of which he fell down into a crumpled heap. Cheerilee silently thanked Rainbow Dash for all the times she'd come to give the kids some karate lessons. Some of it had obviously stuck in her head over the years. Before the colt could do more than roll on his back, Cheerilee descended upon him like a hawk, keeping him down with one hoof, as she started beating him in the face with the other, in the thrones of a blind rage. There was one who stood between her and reaching her goal. She could think of nothing but removing him from her path, right away, no matter what. Snips feebly tried to defend himself, but he was a lot smaller than the mare, not to mention a unicorn, while she had all the physical powers of an earth pony to fall back on. The beating continued mercilessly, and Snip's face swelled up and blood rolled out of his nose and down to the places where she broke through his skin. In an act of desperation, the subconscious part of his mind reached out into a magical reserves he didn't think he had, and his horn started to glow green with power. All of a sudden, a wave of arcane energy zipped past Cheerilee's head, leaving a long, thin cut stretching the length of her cheek. The fuchsia-colored mane gasped in surprise, as blood started trickling down from her wound, which wasn't all that serious, although it did sting a little. Her gaze dropped down to the colt's cutie mark, and she realized she should have seen this coming. His specialty obviously involved cutting of some kind, and apparently he wasn't restricted to the use of scissors. A subtle change in the aura around the horn warned Cheerilee that another spell was about to be flung at her. So, with no other option in mind, she raised a hoof before ramming it down to dish out another punch. only this time she didn't aim for Snip's face, but for the horn itself. As she hit her target, the colt's head jerked back as he groaned as the horn tugged at his skull. The spell discharged into the wall behind him instead of its intended target. The magical light around the horn flickered for a moment before coming back in force, and Cheerilee just knew the next spell was already on its way. She once again started raining down punches, now aiming all of them at the horn, spells exploding against the walls, ceiling, and floor left and right, sending tiny pieces of rubble flying everywhere. At first, the colt took the beating like a stallion, but as the mare hit the same spot time and time again, it became increasingly difficult for him to fight back against the pain that was rising in his skull. All of a sudden, little cracks started to appear in the horn, until one final strike from Cheerilee broke it off. When that happened, magic exploded into the room, throwing Cheerilee off the colt and making her slide several meters over the floor, until she came to a halt a few meters away from Snips. The magical feedback seemed to have been a lot worse for the Scion Pony himself, as he lay witlessly on the floor. Scrambling to her hooves, the fuchsia mare picked up Snip's horn as she passed it on the way to his motionless form, clenching it between her front hooves like a dagger as she kneeled over him. With a moment's hesitation, she rammed the horn straight into his chest. Blood spattered everywhere and welled up underneath Cheerilee's hooves. The colt's eyes shot open, and he stared first at his chest and then at her. "Why?" he managed to whisper hoarsely, as life fled from his body. Cheerilee didn't bother to answer his question, simply pulling the horn out of his body and ramming it back into his chest, a few times for good measure, until he stopped moving altogether. Cheerilee panted heavily, from actual physical exertion this time, as she rolled off of Snip's corpse, trying to catch her breath as she just lay on the cold floor. Killing him like this had been quite exhilarating in its own right, even if it did all end rather fast. She looked over her own cheek, sampling her own blood for the first time, and finding it not altogether unpleasant, even if it did feel a bit strange. She was glad she had been able to try this struggle for survival approach, at least once, though, even in her original plan for Apple Bloom and him had been 1,000 times more elegant. The realization suddenly hit her with a sickening force. Her plans for Snips and Apple Bloom. The plan required both of them to maneuver each other into the right places, and even after the next few steps also required interaction between them. Now that Snips was gone, it couldn't possibly work. And that was the least of her troubles. The play still had one more scene to go, and Snips was supposed to be in it. The mare began thinking up countless new plans on the spot, but she rejected them all out of hand for being too ridiculous, too short-sighted, too dangerous, and too risky. She began to fear the situation was hopeless, that she had finally maneuvered herself into a corner she could not escape from. To keep the audience in the dark, the final scene had to go on without a hitch, so some pony had to go out there and play against Apple Bloom. With no pony else left from the original cast, she could count only on herself. She'd have to improvise, and it probably would not work, but it was the best shot she had. The only shot she had. She quickly galloped towards the dressing area, and headed into the back room, wiping the blood off of herself with a rag before opening the chest that held Reginald's final costume. It was way too small for her, of course, but it included a particularly dashing brooch she could use as a fastener. Cheerilee quickly pricked up the brooch and continued on towards the back of the room, where several bolts of cloth lay stashed. She chose a black piece that was just large enough to fit around her body, and swung it over her back, using the brooch as a clasp around her neck, and ended up with something vaguely reminiscent of a hooded cloak. It wouldn't hold up to a scrutiny, but since the audience would only see her from far away, it just might do. At least, she hoped so. As a finishing touch, she slid a knife she found on a nearby table through the fabric, improvising some manner of sheath so that the blade rested against her chest, relatively hidden. The mare then dashed off in the direction of the stage, realizing that she had no time to waste. She brought up a mental map of the building on the fly to figure out exactly where she had to go. For the next scene, Reginald was supposed to emerge out of a mountain cave after the king had climbed up to that mountain to meet his challenge. Knowing that, Cheerilee rounded a turn and rushed up a flight of stairs, emerging at last into the dark cave at the top of the mountain. From there she could see the audience, but she was quite sure the darkness still hid her from them. Judging from the fact that Apple Bloom was nowhere in sight, she had made it in time. She quietly congratulated herself over this accomplishment as she took a few moments to catch her breath and rest up, fearing she may soon need the energy. It only took her a minute to start hearing the filly's voice coming closer, and pretty soon after that she came into view, having made her way up the mountain slope. She was wearing relatively simple attire compared to the royal mantle from earlier. She had a sheathed toy sword with her, attached to her side, where she could easily reach the pommel with her teeth. "Reginald, I have come to face your challenge. Come out, and fight like a stallion," King Golden Crown roared, looking around defiantly. Cheerilee took one deep breath and hid her face a bit deeper under the hood, even though she wasn't sure why. It wouldn't fool anyone, or at least not for very long. Swallowing back her fear, she stepped out of the cave and onto the highest point of the stage. The mountain summit was located several meters above the mine Scootaloo had disappeared into earlier. But, as it was placed all the way to the back of the stage, even the ponies occupying the front rows could see the actors up there relatively easily. Cheerilee could hear the crowd talking and whispering to each other as she stepped out of the shadows. They were obviously wondering what in the hay she was doing up there on the stage. Apple Bloom herself was even more confused. She had expected to see Snips there, not her teacher. "Miss Cheerilee, what are you?" she began to say quietly. "I see you have come, O brave king, and I applaud your bravery. As a token of my respect, I shall face you here, in my one true form. Up till now, witchcraft and sorcery have hidden me from your eyes, but no longer. Tonight, we fight an honest battle." Cheerilee's voice boomed through the complex, easily going over Apple Bloom's. The explanation sounded tacky, even to her own ears, but it was the best she'd been able to come up with on such short notice. In a sudden moment of inspiration, she gave Apple Bloom a conspirator's wink, praying the filly would play along. Whatever the filly had assumed Cheerilee meant by it, she suddenly grinned and nodded eagerly, as if to say, "Oh, I got it." "Oh, fiend! Ah! Knew there was more afoot when you bested my most trusted advisors. Witchcraft! This explains a lot indeed," the king responded, Apple Bloom's accent playing up slightly as they strayed from the original script. But the fuchsia mare couldn't have cared less at that point, so relieved she was that the other pony was playing along with her ruse. "Well then, let us dance," she cried out as she reached for her right hoof under her cloak to draw the knife, keeping 3 hooves on the floor as she pointed the blade at her opponent. The filly in turn took the pommel of her toy sword between her teeth and consumed a combative stance. The sword was far too big for her to carry in a hoof, as Cheerilee did with her knife, so for her this was the only option. That alone made the odds heavily favor the mare, and on top of that, one of them was wielding a real knife, while the other one was only holding a mostly harmless plastic toy. The entire fighting scene had been carefully choreographed, so Apple Bloom naturally stuck to her predetermined moves, and she expected Cheerilee to play by the books as well. Cheerilee would certainly have been capable of doing so, had she been so inclined, since she was the one who planned out the entire thing, after all. She was, however, extremely anxious to get this all over with quickly. As soon as Apple Bloom advanced, Cheerilee stepped forward as well, intentionally allowing herself to get within the filly's sword's reach. Instead of parrying Apple Bloom's swing with a dagger, as the filly expected, she jerked her head back to dodge it, confusing the hay out of Apple Bloom and throwing her off balance completely. The fuchsia mare quickly followed up with an attack of her own, which left a nasty cut over the filly's left cheek. almost the twin of the cut Cheerilee, still hid under her hood. Apple Bloom let out a sharp cry, more out of surprise than out of pain, as she stumbled backwards. She looked at the red liquid dripping down from the knife, and then at Cheerilee, who stared back coldly from underneath the hood. "Wait, is this a she began saying, the words muffled by the pommel in her mouth. But Cheerilee didn't at all feel like letting down the pressure now, and simply rushed forward. Apple Bloom panicked and swung her sword, hitting Cheerilee right in the face in the process. Cheerilee almost lost her balance as her head got slammed to the side, but somehow she managed to turn the movement into a 180-degree spin, buckling her hind legs and kicking the filly. She hit her right in the chest, and the sheer force of the blow sent the little one flying across the stage, until she landed roughly on her back, a meter or two away. The filly took a deep breath. A stinging pain in her chest alerted her to the fact that all was not well, and she didn't seem to be able to draw in as much air as usual either. She realized Cheerilee had probably broken some of her ribs, and still felt dazed from the landing too. Her teacher, however, wasted no time and descended upon the fallen Apple Bloom, like a vulture, ramming the knife through her right shoulder and into the wooden floor below, effectively pinning her down. The filly held back a shriek of pain and swung her sword again, hitting Cheerilee in the head once more. It barely fazed the mare, although it did piss her off. All of a sudden, she brought her head down and headbutted the filly brutally, hoping to knock her out. That was exactly what happened as Apple Bloom's eyes rolled in the back of her head. Suddenly, becoming acutely aware of the audience staring up at her, Cheerilee remembered her last lines, the words traditionally spoken at the end of a Reginald play, even though she'd have to change it up a bit. She clenched her head, as if she had been fatally wounded by the last blow, and then she spoke dramatically. "Oh, what cruel fate! Now we both must die. But I implore you all, stallions and mares, never to forget Reginald the Sly." And then she allowed herself to fall to the floor, remaining there, motionlessly. She never understood those last words herself, or what moral lesson they were supposed to convey, but they got the job done. The technician got the cue, and the curtain started to close, as the audience started to stomp their hooves down on the floor and cheered to show their approval. The play had been, on the whole, pretty well done, and the curious alternative ending did add that certain something. Not to mention the last fighting scene had been glorious, and it didn't look like they were pretending at all. With relief, Cheerilee saw the curtain finally close completely, hiding the stage from the audience's sight. She'd spread the word that the fillies and herself would have to start breaking down the stage props and cleaning up the backstage area right away, since some other group from Canterlot needed the building later on that week. That meant no pony was expecting them back at home anytime soon. She threw a glance at the unconscious filly next to her, who still had the knife embedded in her shoulder, and smiled. She had all the time she needed to figure out something new for this one now. All the time in the world.